The smart doorbell camera blinked red at 11:47 p.m. when I thought I was safe. I had exactly 3 hours before Caleb's shift ended, or so I believed. The guest room door wasn't locked because I never imagined I'd need to lock it. After all, my husband was supposed to be drawing blood samples at the hospital until dawn, not standing in our hallway, holding his forgotten badge, while I frantically pulled sheets over evidence of my betrayal. Ev, Caleb's voice carried that familiar quiet tone, the one that used to comfort me, but now made my skin crawl with its predictable gentleness. Everything okay in there? My heart hammered against my ribs as Jasper Linwood, my husband's best friend since college, and my secret obsession for the past 9 months, pressed himself against the guest room wall, his eyes wide with panic. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who controlled our hospital's entire billing department, who commanded respect from dozens of employees, was now cowering behind a door like a teenager caught sneaking out. "Just changing the sheets," I called back, my voice pitched higher than intended. "Thought I'd get some cleaning done while you were at work." The lie rolled off my tongue with practiced ease. I'd been perfecting these small deceptions for months, each one building upon the last, until dishonesty became as natural as breathing. Caleb's predictable schedule made it simple: Monday and Thursday night shifts, Tuesday morning lab courier runs, Wednesday compliance meetings. I knew his routine better than he did, or so I thought. At midnight, there was something different in his voice now, a sharpness I hadn't heard before. Through the crack under the door, I watched his shadow shift. He wasn't moving toward the bedroom as usual. He was standing there, waiting. The motion sensor light in the hallway stayed on, meaning he hadn't budged from his spot outside the guest room. Jasper mouthed, "Back window," and pointed toward the guest room's rear exit. I shook my head frantically. The motion detection zones on our new security system would log any movement in the backyard. Caleb had installed the upgraded cameras just last month, claiming he wanted better protection for our suburban neighborhood. I'd rolled my eyes at his paranoia then. Now I cursed his thoroughness. "Yeah, couldn't sleep," I said, buying time while Jasper gathered his scattered clothes. "You know how I get when you work nights. Might as well be productive." It was another lie layered on truth. I did hate when Caleb worked nights, but not for the reasons he assumed. His absence didn't make me lonely. It made me reckless. The empty house became my playground, and Jasper Linwood was my favorite game. "I forgot my badge," Caleb said. "Need it for the lab access tonight. New security protocols." Of course he did. Caleb never forgot anything important, which made this slip feel like divine intervention working against me. In 9 months of carefully orchestrated affairs, this was the first time our timing had collapsed so spectacularly. I heard his footsteps moving toward our bedroom, then the familiar sound of him rummaging through his work bag. Jasper took the opportunity to slip out through the guest room door, moving with surprising stealth for a man who spent his days behind a desk. I watched through the window as he crept along our fence line, staying in the camera blind spots he'd helped me identify months ago during one of our security consultations. The bitter irony hit me again. Jasper had been the one to suggest the security upgrade to Caleb, claiming it would give me peace of mind when I was home alone. What he'd really done was create a surveillance system we could game, or so we thought. Every camera angle, every motion zone, every recording schedule had been carefully mapped during our planning sessions, disguised as friendly visits. "Found it," Caleb called from the bedroom. I quickly smoothed the fresh sheets and arranged the decorative pillows, erasing any evidence of the past 2 hours. The guest room had become our preferred meeting spot because it felt separate from the life Caleb and I shared. Our bedroom carried too much history, too many memories of better times. The guest room was neutral territory, where I could pretend my marriage didn't exist. Caleb appeared in the doorway just as I finished tucking the final corner. He looked tired, which wasn't unusual for someone working double shifts to pay for the house I'd insisted we buy. His dark hair was rumpled from the long day. and his phlebotomist uniform was wrinkled from 12 hours of hospital rounds. At 34, he still had the lean build of the college track runner I'd married, but exhaustion had carved new lines around his brown eyes. "Looks good," he said, glancing around the room. "You didn't have to do this so late." "I wanted to." The lie came automatically. "Your mum mentioned she might visit next month. Wanted everything perfect." Eleanor Hartley had indeed mentioned a visit, but that wasn't why I'd been in the guest room. I'd been there because Jasper had texted me at 9 p.m. with our usual code. "Need to discuss those billing reports. Available for consultation." It was our signal, refined over months of practice. I'd respond with "guest office is free," and he'd arrive within the hour. Our affair had started innocently enough, or at least that's how I justified it to myself. Jasper had helped me land the billing specialist position at the hospital where both he and Caleb worked. As the billing director, he had influence over hiring decisions, and he'd made sure my application received special attention. The job paid well, better than my previous work, and came with opportunities for additional consulting fees that had quickly become addictive. "I'll be back around 6, Caleb said, checking his watch. "Try to get some sleep." He leaned down to kiss my forehead, the same gentle gesture he'd performed thousands of times during our 7 years of marriage. Once, that simple affection had made me feel cherished. Now it felt like a burden, a reminder of the good man I was betraying for the thrill of something forbidden. "Drive safe," I murmured, playing the role of concerned wife. As soon as his car pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my phone to text Jasper. The message was already waiting. "Close call. We need to be more careful. Delete this." I deleted it immediately, as I'd done with hundreds of similar messages over the past 9 months. What I didn't know was that Caleb had recently upgraded our home Wi-Fi router to a commercial-grade system that automatically logged all device activity. Every deleted message, every cleared browser history, every carefully erased digital footprint was being quietly archived in a system I didn't even know existed. Standing in the guest room that still carried the faint scent of Jasper's cologne, I felt a mixture of exhilaration and unease. The near discovery had been terrifying, but it also proved how clever we'd become at deception. We'd been operating under Caleb's nose for months, using his own home as our meeting place, exploiting his trust and predictable nature. I told myself he'd never suspect his best friend and devoted wife of such betrayal. Caleb was too trusting, too focused on his work, too comfortable in his assumptions about our marriage. He saw what I wanted him to see, a wife who complained about his long hours, but ultimately supported his career. A friend who looked out for his family's financial security. A household running smoothly, despite his demanding schedule. What I didn't see was Caleb in his car at the end of our street, sitting in the darkness with his phone connected to our home security system. The upgraded cameras I'd dismissed as his paranoid overreach were now streaming live footage directly to his device. He'd watched Jasper's careful exit along the fence line. He'd seen the precise timing of our movements. He'd noted how expertly we'd navigated the motion detection zones. As I prepared for bed, deleting the evening's text thread and clearing my browser history with practiced efficiency, I felt proud of my operational security. I'd become expert at covering my tracks, at maintaining the perfect balance between devoted wife and secret rebel. The thrill of deception had become as addictive as the affair itself. The camera light blinked silently above the guest room door, recording my final preparations. I didn't know then that Caleb had changed the recording settings to capture everything, not just motion-triggered events. Every moment of my careful cleanup was being preserved in high definition, time-stamped, and automatically backed up to cloud storage I couldn't access or delete. I fell asleep that night believing I'd dodged a bullet, that my quick thinking and Jasper's stealth had saved us from discovery. I dreamed of close calls and narrow escapes, of being the clever heroine in my own secret adventure story. I didn't know that the real story was just beginning, and that I wasn't the protagonist I imagined myself to be. The next morning brought an unusual silence. Caleb typically returned from night shifts with stories about difficult patients or complicated lab procedures, small talk that filled our kitchen while he unwound from work. Instead, he moved through our morning routine like a ghost, pouring coffee and checking his phone without the casual conversation that usually marked the end of his overnight shifts. "Rough night?" I asked, testing the waters while scrambling eggs I didn't really want. "Different," he replied without looking up from his phone. "New protocols are changing everything." I watched him scroll through what looked like technical documents, his expression unreadable. Caleb had always been methodical about his work, but there was an intensity to his focus that felt new. He'd positioned himself at the kitchen island, where he could see both the guest room hallway and the backyard through our large windows, a vantage point he'd never chosen before. "What kind of protocols?" I pressed, hoping to sound like a supportive spouse, rather than someone fishing for information about potential security changes. "Digital evidence handling," he said, still not meeting my eyes. "Everything has to be documented now. Every access, every movement, every anomaly. The hospital is cracking down on compliance issues." The word evidence sent a chill through me, though I told myself I was being paranoid. Caleb worked in medical labs, not criminal investigations. His job involved blood samples and test results, not surveillance and documentation. Still, something in his tone suggested these weren't routine procedural updates. "Sounds complicated," I said, forcing lightness into my voice. "It's actually simpler than you'd think. Technology does most of the work now. Cameras, logs, automated backups. Hard to hide anything when everything's being recorded and cross-referenced." He finally looked at me, and I saw something I'd never noticed before. A calculating quality that didn't match the gentle, trusting husband I'd married. It was gone so quickly I wondered if I'd imagined it, replaced by his familiar tired smile. "I'm going to sleep for a few hours," he said, gathering his things. "Then I've got some research to catch up on." Research wasn't typically part of Caleb's job description. As a phlebotomist and lab courier, his work was hands-on and procedural. The mention of research felt significant, though I couldn't pinpoint why it made me uneasy. After he disappeared into our bedroom, I found myself drawn to his study, a small room he'd claimed for managing our finances and pursuing his amateur interest in computer security. The door was closed, which wasn't unusual, but when I tried the handle, I discovered it was locked. In 7 years of marriage, Caleb had never locked his study. My phone buzzed with a message from Jasper. "Coffee later. Need to discuss last night." I deleted the message immediately, then thought better of it. If we were going to continue our arrangement, we needed better communication security. I downloaded a new messaging app with enhanced encryption and sent Jasper the details. What I didn't realize was that our home router was now configured to log all app installations and data transfers, creating a digital paper trail of my operational security improvements. The coffee meeting took place at our usual spot, a busy cafe near the hospital where 2 colleagues grabbing a quick break wouldn't raise eyebrows. Jasper looked as composed as always, his silver-touched hair perfectly styled and his expensive suit projecting the authority that came with running a department. At 35, he'd climbed the hospital hierarchy faster than anyone expected, using charm and strategic thinking to build influence across multiple departments. "That was too close," he said, stirring his cappuccino with unnecessary precision. "But we handled it perfectly," I countered. "He didn't suspect anything, just bad timing with the badge." Jasper's green eyes studied my face with the same analytical intensity he brought to budget reviews and staff evaluations. "Ev, your husband isn't stupid. He's methodical, detail-oriented, trained to notice inconsistencies. That's what makes him good at his job." His job is drawing blood and delivering samples, I said dismissively. Not detective work. His job involves quality control and compliance monitoring. He's trained to spot anomalies, to document irregularities, to follow protocols designed to catch problems before they become disasters. There was something in Jasper's tone that suggested he knew more about Caleb's work than I did, which struck me as odd. Despite their friendship, they worked in different departments with minimal overlap. Billing and lab services operated independently, connected only through the administrative systems that processed test orders and insurance claims. "Are you having second thoughts?" I asked, suddenly worried that our close call had spooked him permanently. "I'm having strategic thoughts," he replied. "We've been sloppy, relying on routine instead of real security. Your husband's schedule isn't as predictable as we assumed." He was right about that. Caleb's night shift schedule had been consistent for months, but hospital staffing was always subject to change. Emergency coverage, training requirements, and administrative meetings could disrupt even the most established patterns. We'd been lucky for 9 months, but luck wasn't a sustainable strategy. "So what do you suggest?" I asked. "Better communication, fewer risks, and definitely no more meetings at your house. We've got other options." Jasper owned a downtown apartment that he'd purchased as an investment property. It was modern, private, and completely separate from both our professional and personal lives. We'd used it occasionally, but I preferred the thrill of our home encounters, the added excitement of forbidden territory. "The apartment feels too clinical," I said. "Like we're just another transaction." "Maybe that's what we should be," Jasper replied, though his hand found mine across the table. "Clean, professional, compartmentalized." His touch still sent electricity through me, the same magnetic attraction that had started this whole affair. Jasper represented everything my marriage lacked: spontaneity, ambition, financial success, and most importantly, the thrill of being chosen over safer options. Where Caleb was predictable and steady, Jasper was dynamic and exciting. Where my husband offered security, my lover offered adventure. "I don't want clinical," I said, intertwining our fingers. "I want this, us, the way we've been doing it." Jasper squeezed my hand, and I saw his resolve weaken. Despite his strategic thinking and professional caution, he was as addicted to our arrangement as I was. The risk was part of the appeal, the knowledge that we were operating in plain sight while maintaining perfect deception. "1 more month," he said finally. "Then we reassess everything." I agreed, though I had no intention of changing our routine. The near discovery had been a fluke, a random coincidence that wouldn't repeat itself. Caleb's schedule would return to normal, his suspicions would fade, and we'd continue our carefully orchestrated affair with renewed caution. What I didn't know was that Caleb hadn't gone to bed after our morning conversation. Instead, he'd spent 3 hours in his locked study, reviewing router logs and camera footage with the methodical precision that made him excellent at quality control. He'd identified patterns I didn't know existed, documented timeline discrepancies I'd never considered, and begun building a comprehensive picture of activities I thought were perfectly hidden. The new messaging app I'd installed was already compromised, its encryption useless against router-level monitoring that captured metadata even when content remained protected. My careful operational security was actually creating more evidence, each protective measure adding another layer to the digital trail I was unknowingly leaving. As Jasper and I parted ways at the cafe, both of us feeling confident about our ability to manage the situation, Caleb was uploading the morning's data collection to a secure cloud storage account I'd never heard of. Every text, every app installation, every suspicious timing correlation was being preserved with the same meticulous attention to detail he brought to lab sample documentation. The quiet exit I'd interpreted as exhaustion was actually strategic withdrawal. The hidden eye I'd dismissed as routine security was now a comprehensive surveillance system designed to capture everything I thought I was hiding. I spent the afternoon at work, processing insurance claims and managing billing disputes with renewed focus. The close call had reminded me how much I had to lose if our affair became public knowledge. My job, my marriage, my carefully constructed social image, everything depended on maintaining the perfect balance between secret rebellion and public respectability. But balance, I was about to learn, was much more fragile than I'd ever imagined. The consulting fees started small, $800 here, $100 and $200 there. Payments that Jasper described as compensation for my specialized knowledge of insurance protocols and billing optimization. As the hospital's billing director, he had discretionary budget for external consultants, and my background made me a logical choice for projects requiring detailed claim analysis. "You're worth every penny," he said, sliding the check across his desk during one of our professional meetings. "Your insights have saved us thousands in rejected claims." The money felt good, better than good. It felt like validation, proof that my skills had value beyond the routine data entry that filled most of my days. Caleb's steady income covered our basic expenses, but these consulting payments opened possibilities we'd never had before. Better restaurants, weekend trips, the kind of financial freedom that made me feel sophisticated and independent. "What kind of projects are we talking about?" I asked, though I was already mentally spending the windfall. "Optimization analysis," Jasper replied smoothly. "Looking for patterns in claim rejections, identifying opportunities for better coding, finding ways to maximize legitimate reimbursements, standard revenue cycle management." It sounded reasonable, even admirable. Healthcare billing was notoriously complex, full of arcane rules and regulatory requirements that could make the difference between profitable operations and financial disaster. If my expertise could help the hospital operate more efficiently, everyone benefited: patients, staff, and the community we served. The work itself seemed straightforward enough. Jasper would provide me with anonymized claim data, and I'd analyze patterns to identify optimization opportunities. My recommendations would be implemented through his department, and I'd receive consulting fees based on the value of my contributions. It was a perfect arrangement that leveraged my skills while providing supplemental income our household budget could definitely use. What I didn't realize was that the optimization involved systematic upcoding, billing for more expensive procedures than were actually performed, adding diagnostic codes that weren't medically necessary, and manipulating claim submissions to maximize reimbursements far beyond legitimate levels. The patterns I was identifying weren't inefficiencies to be corrected, but opportunities for fraud to be exploited. These lab panels could be bundled differently, I suggested during one of our evening work sessions at his apartment. If you code them as comprehensive metabolic panels instead of basic panels, the reimbursement increases by 40%. "Brilliant," Jasper said, making notes while his hand traced patterns on my bare shoulder. "What about the diagnostic imaging orders?" "Those are trickier," I replied, lost in the intellectual puzzle. "But if you can justify contrast enhancement or additional views, the fees jump significantly. You'd need documentation to support the medical necessity, though." "Documentation can be arranged," he said with a confidence that should have worried me. Instead, I felt proud of my analytical abilities and grateful for the opportunity to contribute meaningfully to the hospital's financial health. The consulting fees had grown to $2,800 monthly, more than doubling my take-home income and transforming our household budget from tight to comfortable. I could afford better clothes, nicer dinners, the kind of lifestyle improvements that made me feel successful and valued. Caleb noticed the changes, of course. New outfits, expensive dinners, my sudden willingness to pick up restaurant checks that would have been unthinkable on our previous budget. When he asked about our improved finances, I explained about the consulting work with the casual confidence of someone telling the truth. Jasper's been throwing some projects my way, I said over dinner at a restaurant that cost more than our usual weekly food budget. Billing analysis stuff. Turns out my insurance background is more valuable than I thought. That's great, Caleb replied, though something in his expression suggested mild concern. What kind of analysis? Revenue cycle optimization, looking for patterns in claim processing, identifying opportunities for better coding practices. Pretty technical stuff, but it pays well. I kept the explanation vague, partly because I didn't want to bore him with billing minutiae, and partly because I was beginning to sense that some of our optimizations existed in regulatory gray areas that might not withstand careful scrutiny. Not that I was doing anything wrong. I was simply providing analytical insights that Jasper's department could use to improve their legitimate operations. Just be careful with consulting arrangements, Caleb said quietly. Hospital compliance is getting stricter about outside relationships and potential conflicts of interest. His warning irritated me more than it should have. Caleb had always been cautious to the point of paranoia, seeing problems where none existed and worrying about risks that never materialized. His concern felt like an attempt to control my newfound independence and professional success. It's completely above board, I said firmly. Jasper cleared everything through proper channels. I'm not an employee, just an independent consultant providing specialized analysis. Totally legitimate. What I didn't know was that there were no proper channels for our arrangement. Jasper had created a shell company, Linwood Healthcare Consulting LLC, specifically to generate consulting payments that wouldn't appear in the hospital's official vendor records. The company existed only on paper, with no legitimate business operations beyond funneling money from fraudulent billing schemes into my personal bank account. The shell company was registered to Jasper's downtown apartment, the same location where we conducted our work sessions and where I provided the analytical insights that enabled increasingly sophisticated fraud. Every recommendation I made was implemented through systematic manipulation of medical codes and insurance claims, generating hundreds of thousands in illegitimate reimbursements. Your husband seems concerned about compliance, Jasper mentioned during one of our apartment meetings. Has he said anything specific about billing practices? Just general paranoia, I replied, focused on the claim data spread across his dining table. Caleb worries about everything. Probably comes from working in quality control. He's trained to see problems everywhere. Quality control, Jasper repeated thoughtfully. That's interesting. I didn't realize his lab work involved compliance monitoring. It's mostly sample integrity and chain of custody stuff, I said, though I realized I didn't actually know the details of Caleb's daily responsibilities. Nothing that would overlap with billing operations. But Jasper looked troubled, as if my casual dismissal had revealed information that concerned him. I didn't understand why lab procedures would have any connection to billing practices, or why my husband's quality control experience would be relevant to our consulting arrangement. What I didn't know was that Caleb's job had recently expanded beyond basic phlebotomy. As part of the hospital's new compliance initiatives, lab technicians were being trained to identify suspicious patterns in test orders and diagnostic procedures. Unusual clustering of high reimbursement tests, diagnostic codes that didn't match actual procedures, and billing anomalies that suggested systematic manipulation were all part of their monitoring responsibilities. Caleb had access to the same lab data I was analyzing for optimization, but he was looking at it from the opposite perspective, searching for signs of fraud rather than opportunities for exploitation. Every recommendation I made to Jasper was creating patterns that Caleb was trained to recognize as potential compliance violations. Maybe we should be more discreet about our work, Jasper suggested. Keep the consulting arrangement between us until the projects are complete. Of course, I agreed, though the secrecy felt unnecessary. No point in making Caleb worry about things he doesn't understand. The irony was perfect. I was protecting my husband from concerns about work he was actually better qualified to evaluate than I was. My condescending assumption that he wouldn't understand sophisticated billing analysis was preventing me from recognizing that he understood it well enough to identify it as fraud. As our consulting relationship deepened, so did my financial dependence on the monthly payments. The $2,800 had become essential to maintaining the lifestyle I'd grown to expect, the independence I'd learned to cherish, and the sense of professional accomplishment that made me feel valuable and sophisticated. I was so focused on the money and the intellectual challenge that I never stopped to question why legitimate consulting work needed to be conducted in secret, why proper channels had been bypassed, or why my analytical insights were generating such dramatically increased revenues. The success felt too good to examine too closely. But examination was coming whether I wanted it or not, from the one person whose methodical attention to detail I'd consistently underestimated. Caleb's study had become a fortress of locked drawers and password-protected files. What used to be a casual workspace for paying bills and managing our household finances had transformed into something that felt more like a command center. I'd catch glimpses of multiple monitors, printed spreadsheets, and manila folders with labels I couldn't quite read from the doorway. "New hobby?" I asked one evening, finding him hunched over his computer with the intensity of someone solving complex puzzles. "Work research," he replied without looking away from the screen. "Compliance training requires a lot of documentation review." I moved closer, trying to see what had captured his attention so completely. The screen showed what looked like network logs, endless columns of timestamps, IP addresses, and device identifiers that meant nothing to me, but seemed to tell him a story worth hours of analysis. "Looks complicated," I said, hoping to sound supportive rather than curious. "It's actually straightforward once you understand the patterns," Caleb replied. "Every device leaves traces, every action gets logged, every connection creates records. The hard part isn't collecting the data, it's knowing what to look for." Something in his tone made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Caleb had always been interested in technology, but this felt different, more focused, more purposeful, as if he was building towards something specific, rather than just satisfying casual curiosity. "What kind of patterns?" I asked, genuinely curious despite my growing unease. For the first time since I'd entered the room, Caleb turned to look at me directly. His expression was unreadable, but there was an intensity in his brown eyes that I'd never seen before. "Communication patterns," he said carefully. "When devices connect to networks, when messages are sent and received, when files are downloaded or uploaded, everything leaves a digital footprint, even when people think they're being careful." The explanation felt like a warning, though I told myself I was being paranoid. Caleb was discussing general principles of network monitoring, not making accusations about my behavior. Still, I found myself mentally reviewing my recent digital activities, wondering what kind of footprints I might have left. "Sounds like Big Brother stuff," I said, forcing a laugh. "Good thing we don't have anything to hide." "Good thing," Caleb agreed, but he was already turning back to his screen. That night, I lay awake thinking about digital footprints and communication patterns. My affair with Jasper had involved extensive electronic coordination, text messages, app downloads, email exchanges, and online research about everything from restaurant reservations to hotel bookings. I'd been careful to delete messages and clear browser histories, but Caleb's explanation suggested that deletion might not be enough. The next morning, I decided to upgrade my operational security. I researched VPN services, downloaded additional encrypted messaging apps, and even considered purchasing a separate phone for communications with Jasper. Each security improvement felt like a smart precaution, a reasonable step to protect my privacy in an increasingly connected world. What I didn't realize was that every security measure I implemented was being automatically logged by our home network. The VPN installation, the new messaging apps, the research into burner phones, all of it was creating exactly the kind of suspicious pattern that Caleb's compliance training had taught him to recognize. "You've been busy online lately," he mentioned over breakfast, scrolling through something on his tablet. "Just work stuff," I replied quickly. "The consulting projects require a lot of research." "What kind of research?" The question felt loaded, though his tone remained casually conversational. I found myself scrambling for an explanation that would sound legitimate without revealing too much detail. Industry best practices, regulatory updates, competitive analysis, the usual business research. Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "Makes sense. Though I noticed some of your searches were for privacy tools and secure communications. That seems unusual for billing analysis." My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to remain calm. There were perfectly reasonable explanations for researching privacy tools, and I didn't need to justify my legitimate concerns about online security. "Client confidentiality is a big deal in healthcare consulting," I said. "I need to make sure all my communications are properly protected. Professional responsibility." "Of course," Caleb said, but he was making notes on his tablet. The notes bothered me more than his questions. Caleb had never been the type to document casual conversations, and seeing him record my explanations felt uncomfortably formal. It was as if he was building a case rather than having a discussion. Over the following days, I became increasingly aware of Caleb's documentation habits. He'd take photos of receipts I left on the counter, make copies of mail before I could open it, and ask seemingly innocent questions about my schedule that felt more like interrogation than spousal interest. "How was the consulting meeting?" he'd ask when I returned from evenings at Jasper's apartment. "Productive," I'd reply. "We're making good progress on the revenue optimization project." "What time did it end?" "Around 10, I think. Why?" "Just curious. I worry about you driving alone so late." But his concern felt calculated rather than caring, as if he was collecting timeline data rather than expressing genuine worry about my safety. I started paying closer attention to his questions, looking for patterns in what he asked and when he asked it. The pattern that emerged was troubling. Caleb's questions consistently focused on timing, locations, and communication methods. He wanted to know when I left for meetings, where they took place, how Jasper and I coordinated our schedules, and what kind of work we were actually doing together. "You and Jasper have been spending a lot of time on this project," he observed one evening. "Must be pretty complex work." "It is," I agreed. "Revenue cycle optimization involves analyzing thousands of data points to identify improvement opportunities. Very time-intensive." "I'm sure it is. Good thing you two work so well together." There was something in his tone that made the innocent comment sound like an accusation. I found myself studying his expression, looking for signs of suspicion or jealousy, but his face remained perfectly neutral. "Jasper's been a great mentor," I said carefully. "He's taught me a lot about the business side of healthcare." "I'm sure he has." The conversation felt like a chess match where I couldn't see the board clearly. Caleb was making moves I didn't understand, positioning pieces for an endgame I couldn't anticipate. His questions seemed random, but I was beginning to suspect they followed a logic I wasn't sophisticated enough to recognize. That night, I found myself reviewing our conversation and wondering what information I'd inadvertently revealed. Every answer I'd given was truthful in a narrow sense, but the complete truth would have painted a very different picture of my relationship with Jasper and the nature of our consulting work. I was learning that truth and honesty weren't the same thing, and that someone skilled at asking the right questions could extract a surprising amount of information from seemingly innocent exchanges. Caleb's compliance training had apparently taught him interrogation techniques I'd never encountered before. As I drifted off to sleep, I wondered what other skills my quiet, methodical husband had acquired during his recent professional development. The man I'd married 7 years ago had been gentle and trusting, someone who took people at face value and assumed the best about their motivations. The man asking questions about my consulting work felt like someone entirely different, calculating, strategic, and several steps ahead of me in a game I was just beginning to realize we were playing. The conference room at Regional Medical Center smelled like industrial coffee and nervous sweat. I'd been summoned to what Jasper described as a routine compliance review, standard procedure for consultants working with hospital departments. Nothing to worry about, just administrative formalities to satisfy the legal department's documentation requirements. These meetings are mostly theatre, Jasper had assured me the night before. Compliance officers ask basic questions. We provide standard answers. Everyone signs the appropriate forms. You'll be out of there in 30 minutes. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing my most professional outfit and carrying a folder of documentation that Jasper had prepared to demonstrate the legitimacy of our consulting arrangement. The folder contained project summaries, analytical reports, and payment records that painted a picture of valuable work performed by a qualified independent contractor. The compliance officer was a stern woman in her 50s named Margaret Chen, whose grey suit and no-nonsense demeanour suggested she took her regulatory responsibilities seriously. She was joined by 2 colleagues I didn't recognise, a younger man with a legal pad and an older woman who introduced herself as the hospital's chief financial officer. Ms. Hartley, Margaret began, thank you for joining us today. This is a standard review of consulting relationships to ensure compliance with healthcare regulations and institutional policies. Of course, I replied, settling into my chair with what I hoped was appropriate professional confidence. I'm happy to answer any questions about my work with Mr. Linwood's department. Let's start with the basics, Margaret said, consulting her notes. Can you describe the nature of your consulting services? I launched into the explanation Jasper and I had rehearsed, describing revenue cycle optimization, billing pattern analysis, and process improvement recommendations. The words flowed smoothly, backed by genuine expertise and months of actual analytical work. I felt confident and articulate, like someone who belonged in this room discussing complex healthcare business operations. And these services are provided through Linwood Healthcare Consulting LLC, the CFO asked. That's correct, I confirmed, though something in her tone suggested the question was more significant than it appeared. Interesting, she said, making notes. We have no record of Linwood Healthcare Consulting LLC in our approved vendor database. The room suddenly felt colder. I glanced toward the door, expecting Jasper to arrive and clarify what was obviously an administrative oversight. Surely the vendor registration was just paperwork that hadn't been properly filed or updated in the system. There might be a processing delay, I said carefully. Mr. Linwood handles all the administrative details. Mr. Linwood, Margaret repeated. Would that be Jasper Linwood, Director of Billing Operations? Yes. The same Jasper Linwood who has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation of irregular billing practices. The words hit me like a physical blow. Administrative leave, investigation, irregular billing practices. The professional confidence I'd felt moments earlier evaporated, replaced by a growing sense that I'd walked into something much more serious than a routine compliance review. I wasn't aware of any investigation, I said truthfully. Of course not, Margaret replied. These matters are handled confidentially until all facts are established. However, your consulting relationship with Mr. Linwood is part of the scope of our review. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the conference room door. Margaret called, "Come in," and I turned, expecting to see Jasper arriving to explain the misunderstanding. Instead, a man in a cheap suit entered, carrying a manila envelope and a clipboard. "Evadne Hartley?" he asked, looking directly at me. "Yes?" "You've been served." He handed me the envelope and had me sign his clipboard, all while the compliance officers watched in silence. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, official and ominous in a way that made my fingers tremble as I tried to open it. The first document was a civil complaint filed in federal court, naming me as a defendant in a case involving healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. The second was a restraining order, prohibiting me from accessing hospital property or contacting current employees. The third was a notice of asset seizure, freezing my bank accounts, pending resolution of criminal charges. "What is this?" I asked, though the legal language was clear enough to understand even through my shock. "Ms. Hartley," Margaret said gently, "I think you should contact an attorney." As I sat staring at the legal documents, the conference room door opened again. This time, 2 people in FBI windbreakers entered, followed by a man I recognized as the hospital's chief of security. The federal agents introduced themselves politely and asked if I would be willing to answer some questions about billing practices and consulting arrangements. "I want a lawyer," I said, the words coming automatically despite my confusion about what was happening. "That's your right," one of the agents replied. "But you should know that we have extensive documentation of fraudulent billing schemes involving systematic upcoding and insurance fraud. Your consulting reports provided the analytical framework for these schemes, and your bank records show you received substantial payments derived from fraudulent claims." The room was spinning. Fraudulent billing schemes, systematic upcoding, insurance fraud. The optimization work I'd been so proud of, the analytical insights that had made me feel valuable and sophisticated, were apparently criminal activities that had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal profits. "I didn't know," I said weakly. "I thought it was legitimate consulting work." "Perhaps," the agent said. "That's something we'll need to investigate thoroughly. However, we also have evidence of identity theft involving the misuse of medical credentials belonging to your husband, Caleb Hartley." Identity theft. My husband's credentials. I had no idea what they were talking about, but the mention of Caleb's name sent a new wave of panic through me. Whatever I'd gotten involved in had apparently expanded beyond my consulting work to include crimes I didn't even understand. "I never used my husband's credentials for anything," I protested. "According to our records, insurance claims were submitted using Mr. Hartley's provider identification numbers to authorize diagnostic tests that were then upcoded according to your analytical recommendations. The combination of identity theft and billing fraud significantly increases the potential penalties you're facing." The agent's explanation was devastating. Not only had I unknowingly participated in billing fraud, but the scheme had involved stealing Caleb's professional identity to legitimize false insurance claims. My analytical work hadn't just optimized billing practices, it had provided the blueprint for systematic fraud that exploited my husband's credentials and reputation. "We'd like to search your home and seize any computers or documents related to your consulting work," the second agent said. "We have a warrant, but we'd prefer your cooperation." I nodded numbly, still trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. The consulting work that had made me feel independent and valuable had actually made me a federal criminal. The money I'd thought was payment for legitimate expertise had actually been proceeds from fraud. The man I'd trusted to guide my professional development had apparently been using me to enable crimes I was too naive to recognize. As we prepared to leave the conference room, Margaret Chen handed me a business card. "Miss Hartley," she said quietly, "you're going to need excellent legal representation. This is a complex case with serious potential consequences." Walking through the hospital corridors flanked by federal agents, I felt the stares of colleagues and staff members who had known me as a competent billing specialist. Now I was a suspect in a criminal investigation, someone whose professional reputation was destroyed beyond repair. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being escorted out of the same building where Caleb worked, past the lab where he drew blood samples and maintained the quality control standards that had apparently detected the very fraud I'd helped enable. His methodical attention to detail, the compliance training I'd dismissed as paranoia, had positioned him to recognize patterns of criminal activity that I'd been too blinded by money and ego to see. As the federal agents drove me home to execute their search warrant, I wondered when Caleb had realized what I was involved in and why he hadn't warned me before it was too late to avoid criminal charges. The answer, I was about to discover, was more devastating than the charges themselves. The search warrant execution felt like a violation that went beyond the legal authority it represented. Federal agents moved through our home with methodical efficiency, photographing everything, cataloging personal belongings, and seizing computers, phones, and documents that represented 7 years of shared life, now reduced to potential evidence in a criminal case. "Where's your husband?" Agent Morrison asked as his partner carried my laptop out to their vehicle. "At work," I replied, though I realized I wasn't entirely sure. Caleb's schedule had become unpredictable recently, and I'd stopped paying close attention to his comings and goings while I was focused on my consulting work with Jasper. "Actually, he's not," Agent Morrison said, checking his phone. "Mr. Hartley is currently at our field office, providing additional documentation related to this investigation." The words hit me like a physical blow. Caleb wasn't just aware of the investigation, he was actively participating in it. My husband, the man I'd been betraying for 9 months, was helping federal agents build a case against me. "Additional documentation?" I asked weakly. "Mr. Hartley has been cooperating with our investigation for several weeks," Agent Morrison explained. "His initial report to the HHS Office of Inspector General prompted this entire case. Without his detailed documentation, we might never have identified the scope of the billing fraud." Several weeks. While I'd been congratulating myself on my operational security and sophisticated deception, Caleb had been systematically documenting my crimes and building a federal case against me. Every question about my consulting work, every casual inquiry about my schedule, every seemingly innocent conversation had been part of an investigation I was too arrogant to recognize. "He reported me?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. "Mr. Hartley reported suspicious billing patterns that appeared to involve identity theft using his medical credentials," Agent Morrison corrected. The investigation that followed revealed extensive fraud involving multiple parties, including you and Mr. Linwood. As the agents continued their search, I found myself thinking about all the times Caleb had tried to warn me about compliance issues and potential conflicts of interest. His concerns hadn't been paranoia or attempts to control my independence. They'd been genuine warnings from someone who understood healthcare regulations better than I did. "Can I call him?" I asked. "Mr. Hartley has requested no contact during the investigation," Agent Morrison said. "There's also a protective order that prohibits you from contacting him or visiting his workplace." A protective order. My own husband had obtained legal protection from me, as if I were a dangerous criminal rather than someone who'd made mistakes while trying to build a better life for our family. The realization that I'd become someone Caleb needed protection from was more devastating than the criminal charges. "What happens now?" I asked. "That depends on several factors," Agent Morrison replied. "The scope of your cooperation, the extent of your knowledge about the fraudulent schemes, your willingness to provide testimony about other participants. Mr. Linwood is facing more serious charges as the primary architect of the fraud, but your role in providing analytical support and your benefit from the proceeds make you a significant defendant. Jasper was facing more serious charges. The man who'd promised to protect me, who'd assured me that our consulting arrangement was completely legitimate, had apparently thrown me under the bus the moment federal agents knocked on his door. My lover and professional mentor had become my co-defendant, and our shared liability would prevent either of us from helping the other. "I want to cooperate," I said quickly. I didn't know the billing practices were fraudulent. I thought I was providing legitimate consulting services. "That's something you'll need to discuss with your attorney," Agent Morrison said. "But I should tell you that we have extensive evidence of your knowledge and participation in the fraudulent schemes. Your consulting reports provided detailed instructions for upcoding practices, and your communications with Mr. Linwood demonstrate awareness that the billing practices were designed to maximize reimbursements beyond legitimate levels. My communications with Jasper, the text messages I'd thought were safely deleted, the emails I'd assumed were private, the digital trail I'd believed was completely erased, all of it had been recovered and analyzed by federal investigators who specialized in financial crimes." "How did you recover deleted messages?" I asked. "Your husband provided access to router logs and network monitoring data that captured all digital communications from your home internet connection," Agent Morrison explained. "Deletion doesn't eliminate data that's been automatically backed up to network storage systems." Caleb's network monitoring. The compliance training I'd dismissed as boring technical work had actually equipped him with sophisticated surveillance capabilities that he'd used to document my affair and criminal activities. My husband had been running a counterintelligence operation in our own home, collecting evidence while I congratulated myself on my clever deception. As the search concluded, Agent Morrison handed me a business card and a list of seized items that included everything electronic I owned. "Ms. Hartley," he said, "you're facing serious federal charges that could result in significant prison time. I strongly recommend that you retain experienced counsel immediately." After the agents left, I sat in our violated home trying to process the magnitude of my situation. The consulting work that had made me feel independent and valuable had been criminal fraud. The money I'd thought was payment for expertise had been proceeds from identity theft. The man I'd trusted as a lover and mentor had been using me to enable crimes that could destroy my life. But the deepest betrayal was my own. I'd betrayed a husband who'd tried to warn me, who'd loved me enough to give me opportunities to stop before it was too late, who'd ultimately been forced to choose between protecting me and protecting himself from my criminal activities. Caleb had chosen correctly, and I hated him for it, almost as much as I hated myself for making his choice necessary. The phone rang, interrupting my spiral of self-pity and regret. I expected it to be my sister Lynn or my mother, someone from my family who might offer support during this crisis. Instead, it was an automated message from our bank informing me that all accounts had been frozen pending resolution of federal charges. No money, no job, no husband, no lover, and no future that didn't involve federal prison. I'd achieved the independence I'd craved, but it looked nothing like what I'd imagined. As evening approached, I realized Caleb wouldn't be coming home. Our marriage was over, destroyed by my choices and his methodical response to them. The house felt empty, in a way that had nothing to do with the agent's search, and everything to do with the life I'd systematically dismantled through my own arrogance and stupidity. I'd thought I was the clever protagonist in my own secret adventure story. Instead, I'd been the predictable antagonist in someone else's story of justice and accountability. The final chapter was about to be written, and I wouldn't like how it ended. 6 months later, I stood in federal court wearing an orange jumpsuit and restraints, waiting to hear my sentence for healthcare fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy charges. The woman who'd once felt sophisticated and independent now looked like exactly what she'd become, a common criminal who'd traded her integrity for money and excitement. Jasper had been sentenced the previous week to 27 months in federal prison and ordered to pay $340,000 in restitution. His cooperation with prosecutors had earned him a reduced sentence, but it had also confirmed every detail of my participation in the billing fraud scheme. His testimony had been clinical and devastating, describing me as an enthusiastic participant who'd provided the analytical framework that made large-scale fraud possible. Your Honor, my attorney said, Ms. Hartley was manipulated by a more sophisticated criminal who exploited her professional expertise and personal vulnerabilities. She believed she was providing legitimate consulting services and had no knowledge of the fraudulent billing practices. It was a reasonable defense strategy, but it contradicted the evidence that prosecutors had methodically assembled. My own consulting reports demonstrated detailed knowledge of upcoding practices. My communications with Jasper showed awareness of regulatory violations, and my financial records proved I'd received substantial payments derived from fraudulent claims. Ms. Hartley, the judge said, you have a college education, professional experience in healthcare billing, and specialized knowledge of insurance regulations. The court finds it difficult to believe that someone with your qualifications could unknowingly participate in systematic fraud over a period of 9 months. The judge was right, of course. I'd known the optimization practices were questionable, but I'd chosen to ignore red flags because the money was too good and the intellectual challenge too appealing. My willful blindness didn't excuse criminal behavior, and my claims of ignorance weren't credible given my professional background. Furthermore, the judge continued, the evidence shows that you used your husband's medical credentials to legitimize fraudulent insurance claims, a violation of trust that goes beyond financial crimes to include identity theft and professional misconduct. Using Caleb's credentials had been Jasper's idea, a way to add legitimacy to billing practices that might otherwise raise compliance flags. I'd provided his provider identification numbers without fully understanding how they would be used, but ignorance wasn't a defense for identity theft. The court sentences you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. You are ordered to pay $127,000 in restitution and are permanently barred from employment in healthcare-related industries. 18 months in prison, 2 years of probation, $127,000 in restitution I had no ability to pay. Permanent exclusion from the only industry where my professional skills had value. The sentence was devastating but fair, reflecting the serious nature of crimes I'd committed while pursuing independence and excitement. As the bailiff prepared to escort me back to detention, I caught sight of Caleb in the courtroom gallery. He looked older than his 34 years, worn down by months of investigation, testimony, and legal proceedings that had destroyed our marriage and upended his life. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw something I'd never expected, not anger or satisfaction, but sadness for what we'd both lost. After the hearing, my attorney explained the final details of my legal situation. The divorce had been finalized while I was in detention, with Caleb receiving all marital assets as compensation for identity theft and fraud committed using his credentials. The house, cars, and savings accounts I'd thought of as ours were now entirely his, along with legal authority to pursue additional civil remedies if he chose. Your husband could have sought much larger damages, my attorney explained. His restraint in the civil proceedings probably saved you from complete financial ruin. Even in divorce, Caleb had shown more consideration for my welfare than I'd shown for his during 9 months of systematic betrayal. His methodical approach to justice had been precise and proportional, designed to hold me accountable without destroying me completely. The federal prison where I would serve my sentence was a minimum security facility in another state, far from the community where my crimes had occurred and my reputation had been destroyed. I would have 18 months to think about the choices that had brought me there, 18 months to consider what kind of person I wanted to be when I was released. My mother Roxana had stopped taking my calls after the arrest, unable to reconcile her encouragement of my independence with the criminal behavior it had enabled. My sister Lynn had visited once, but the conversation had been awkward and painful, full of questions I couldn't answer, and judgments I couldn't dispute. The consulting fees that had made me feel valuable and sophisticated had actually been payments for criminal services that destroyed my career, my marriage, and my future. The independence I'd craved had become complete isolation, and the excitement I'd pursued had become the monotony of federal incarceration. As the transport van carried me away from the courthouse, I thought about the smart doorbell camera that had started this whole chain of events. If Caleb hadn't forgotten his badge that night, if he hadn't returned home unexpectedly, if the motion sensors hadn't captured Jasper's careful exit, would we have continued our affair indefinitely? Would the billing fraud have grown larger and more sophisticated? Would the eventual reckoning have been even worse? I'd never know, but I suspected that discovery was inevitable. Caleb's methodical nature and professional expertise would have eventually identified patterns of criminal activity that I was too arrogant to hide effectively. The digital trail I'd left was comprehensive enough that any competent investigator would have unraveled the entire scheme. The guest room wasn't locked because I'd never imagined I'd need to lock it. But the real security breach wasn't physical, it was moral. I'd unlocked every ethical boundary that might have protected my marriage, my career, and my freedom, and I'd done it voluntarily in pursuit of money and excitement that had never been worth the cost. Caleb's revenge hadn't been loud or violent. It had been lawful, methodical, and absolutely devastating. He'd used my own crimes against me, letting justice take its course while he rebuilt his life without the wife who'd betrayed him so completely. I'd thought I was the clever protagonist in my own secret adventure story. Instead, I'd been the predictable antagonist in a story about consequences, accountability, and the price of betraying people who trusted you. The last thing I saw through the transport van window was the city skyline fading into the distance, taking with it everything I'd lost through my own choices. The door had closed behind me, and there was no going back to the life I'd systematically destroyed. I'd always thought I'd get the last laugh.